Hi, I'm Zack Carlson from the Alamo Drafthouse in Austin, Texas, and we're here at Studio SX to interview Elijah Drenner, who's the director of American Grindhouse, a new documentary playing at South by Southwest 2010. Thanks for coming out.
Thanks for having me.
A lot of people that enjoy movies understand what exploitation films are and what the word Grindhouse has come to represent now. But there are people out there who might not be aware. So could you give me some words that kind of describe stuff that pops up in these movies?
Stuff that pops up in Grindhouse exploitation stuff. Nudity, gore, Nazis, women in prison. It could be anything that is excessive. And if you can do something in excess and tell a story, that's really I think, the heart of exploitation.
And traditionally, who were the types of people that went to see these movies? Were they like the physically deformed or like
Could have been
sadists and maniacs, or what was the audience like for these movies?
I think the audience has evolved. These movies, really when they started, they had to compete with major Hollywood films. This documentary starts all the way back into the early 1900s. And there was a studio system in place where the studios actually owned their movie theaters, and they had a list of things they could not do in their movies. But there were movie theaters that were not owned by major studios, and these exploitation filmmakers would use that very same list of what they couldn't do to actually put in their movie to get an audience to come see their movie. So, it was everything from interracial relationships, nudity, vice, any kind of drug use, alcohol, whatever was prohibited to people were the marching orders for these exploitation filmmakers. And some of them were successful, some of them were not, but they were things you had to seek out. You had to go out of your way to go to these kind of movies. You had to go downtown to a bad part of town to see these movies where you may risk your life. And so that was symbolic in some way of the kind of movies that played in these theaters.
So when people are talking about Grindhouse movies, the Grindhouse actually is the location the movie played in.
Yeah, Grindhouse is pretty vague. I don't really know if I completely understand what it is. It's just a great buzzword. It conjures up all these great images of grinding. I don't know, but it conjures up all these great fantasies of what a grindhouse is. And it really was, now I think in hindsight, in retrospect, it's a way to describe these kind of movies, but I really don't think people in the 70s were saying, let's go to the grindhouse.
Right.
They were saying, let's go to the Cameo Theater down on 42nd and catch a double bill of kung fu movies.
But in a lot of ways, the venues themselves are kind of crucial to the lore of these types of movies and the culture that kind of came up around them.
Absolutely, absolutely. And we do talk a little bit about that, but it's really more about the history of these movies. 90 minutes of people talking about memories of movie theaters is hardly exciting. We tried doing a version of that. It just wasn't that thrilling.
Now, 42nd Street comes up a lot when people talk about, the history of exploitation films. And New York, of course, was this kind of ground zero for this type of stuff, but it was all over America.
Yeah, it really was.
In drive-ins in the South and everything.
Absolutely. And see, that's why you can't really say grind, because it's farther than that. Grindhouses were sort of the inner city versions of drive-ins. They could go a little more hardcore. But the drive-ins were riffraff. They were sort of the redheaded stepchild of the community. Well, not necessarily, but it was a place that you could kind of let loose.
I guess I bring it up because exploitation found its audience everywhere. It wasn't just, you didn't have to be in a big city, but it was like rural people and everybody wanted to see these movies.
Absolutely. That's really what exploitation is. It's appealing to, it's a marketing term. That's what exploitation is. If you look at any old press book, whether it was a studio film or an exploitation film, it was right there. This is how you can exploit your movie. So it was described, it was really just, like I said, like a marketing term.
I guess I really enjoyed in the documentary how it was a balance between talking about the filmmakers and the content of the movies themselves, and then just the experience of really being like punched in the guts by these movies.
Mm-hmm.
Who were the filmmakers that you think maybe took it almost too far, if there are any? I know I'm jumping around.
People who took making a movie too far?
Yeah, people who like took these things that were kind of forbidden by studios and stuff. And is there anybody that you think just like kind of overjuiced that idea?
Well, you know, there was always somebody there pushing it as far as they could possibly go. You know, if there was, you know, audiences were really desperate to see what they would call pickles and beavers back then. And if it had to be a baby coming out of a vagina or a syphilis-ridden penis, that's how you saw it. And it was under the guise of education. And I mean, like, can you imagine that now? I mean, I mean, now we're sort of disgusted by it. We get the irony of it, but I mean, that's how you would have to see those things under the guise of education.
And this is more like in the 50s, early 60s.
That's actually, yeah, like in the 30s and 40s.
They were showing the birth and stuff, like Mom and Dad and all this.
Oh yeah, Mom and Dad's from 1941.
Right.
And I mean, that was the third highest grossing film of the decade.
Because they showed an actual birth in
Yeah,
this
I mean,
film.
and it was so notorious.
Right.
You know, now in movies, if something's not good, you know, everyone knows, or at least there's a venue and a podium for people to tell people very quickly if something's not as good or doesn't live up to the expectations. Back then, if something stunk, it was on to the next town,
right,
where nobody knew about it. There were a lot of suckers. I think there are still suckers, but we're just a little more educated and faster.
You just brought up exploitation movies were around, you know, 40s, 50s, and all the way back to the beginning of films, and that's something you hit on in the movie. Mm-hmm. Is how exploitation has always been there as part of filmmaking.
That's the core of show business.
But people got it in their heads that an exploitation movie meant the 70s.
Yeah, I'm not sure how or where that happened. You know, it's not like someone just all of a sudden discovered, wow, you know, we could really show people doing it. You know, that didn't. I mean, it was an evolution. It was, you know, it was birth of a baby stuff, and then it was gradually, well, let's put naked people walking around in nudist camps. That's how we can show nudity. But then that was pretty boring, and so it was like, well, now we got to add a plot. Well, so someone like Russ Meyer adds a story to it, and it's a very clever story. And actually, something like Immoral Mr. Tease is actually a really well-made, interesting movie. He was a photographer. He knew how to compose shots. And then that got boring. And then they started adding a little bit of violence and conflict, and then they became a little more rough, and they called roughies. And then someone like Herschel Gordon Lewis was like, you know, we've got color film. It's more accessible to independent filmmakers now. Let's make something explicitly gory. And so then that came along. And then it's hard to say that things don't go quite step by step, but blanket terms, you can really go kind of film by film and take a look at just the evolution of how you got to something as explicit as Ilsa, She-Wolf of the SS.
And by the time this stuff reached the point where people recognize, like, oh, these are exploitation movies or these are horror movies that kind of fall into this category, and people now think of that as like the 70s, even some people think the early 80s are part of that.
Yeah.
I guess, do you actually feel that that spirit continues on, or?
I don't know. I think we're too hip to it. We know that we get the put on. I don't think that. I think you know, everyone. We're very nostalgic. You know, nostalgia is something very funny, and my nostalgia is different than your nostalgia. And you know, nostalgia is just as vague as Grindhouse. You know what I mean? And I think if something's under the radar, if something kind of surprises you and shocks you, then that's to me that's exploitation. But now, you know, if we're gonna tell you that it's shocking and tell you that it's exploitation, you've lost the hook.
It's like trying to make a deliberately campy movie. There's no value in it because everyone's winking at the camera.
Exactly. You can't do it.
Yeah.
You can't do it. It's hard to do. I mean, you could do it. I mean, like, you know, someone had mentioned to me Antichrist. You know, like that to me was a pretty shocking exploitation movie.
I see that. And then John Landis in your movie mentions Passion of the Christ while we're on the Christ subject as being an exploitation movie.
Yeah. I don't know if it's quite an exploitation movie, but I think it's a little bit better made. But certainly the ballyhoo surrounding Passion of the Christ, you know, someone like Kroger Babb he would just
Kill for
be,
that.
exactly. I mean, it's like, you know, churches were taking buses to go to the mall to see this movie. It was released on Easter. I mean, come on. I mean, it's everything. I mean, that is show business, and that's what the documentary is about.
So, I guess going to your personal side of this, you worked on this thing for a long time. Can you tell us when you started on this and really what sparked you saying, I'm going to make this documentary?
Well, it started really when I was in film school in about 2000, 2001. I was just a huge fan of Jack Hill, and no one knew who Jack Hill was. And so I was like, I'm going to just make a documentary about Jack Hill. And so then that steamrolled into learning about exploitation and wanting to interview all these other people, and couldn't get the money, and it segued into doing a documentary about the entire exploitation film industry. So it was actually much harder in hindsight, but it worked out.
All right. Well, I really, really enjoyed the movie. I think
you.
only an asshole would not enjoy the movie. So thank you for making it. And
Thank
thanks
you.
for talking, and they're making us leave now.
Thank you. Adios.
All right. Thank you. Thank you.